Now, am I telling you that Poe is the first person to write a scary story? Of course not. Scary stories actually go back to the cavemen. But Poe is the first human being to write up a scary story in an artistic way from a psychological point of view of the killer or the mad person himself that makes horror respectable. He makes the topic and theme of terror something artistic and respectable. And what does this mean? It means for better or worse, there could be no Stephen King today without Edgar Allan Poe. He allows intelligent people to write about horror in a respectable way. And he did something else, by the way, far more important. At the same young age of 20, he invents the modern short story, because it is Poe who came up with the principle every sentence of a short story must contribute to a single effect. In the case of Poe, it is horror. But if you read any short story today in the New Yorker or any other place they publish good short stories, all of them subscribe to Poe's theory. How much money does Poe get for inventing the tale of terror and the short story? Nothing, because nobody wants to read these horrible things. They are way, way before their time. And Poe probably would have starved, but at this point, a woman comes up to him and says, "You don't know me, Edgar. My name is Maria Clem. But my brother's name was David Poe. My brother David was your no-good father, the dancer. I know he deserted you at birth and helped ruin your life. I am your Aunt Maria, his sister. I have spent 2 years looking for you. Now that I found you, I'm going to make up to you what my brother, as your father, could never do. I'm going to adopt you legally as my son. You're going to move into my house. I'm going to feed you, look after you, give you a place to write. I'm your Aunt Maria, and I care." This is what Poe thought he had always wanted, family who could help him. But like everything else in Poe's life, it turns into a complete disaster. He moves in with Aunt Maria and then discovers that Aunt Maria already had 5 children. Her husband had died, so she has these 5 kids by herself to support. She can barely support them, let alone her new adopted 21-year-old Edgar Allan Poe. But that wasn't the disaster. The disaster occurred when Poe looks over his new brothers and sisters, who are actually, of course, his first cousins. He looks over Aunt Maria's children, and the youngest child of Aunt Maria, a real pretty young woman named Virginia, he takes one look at Virginia, his cousin and adopted sister. Not only is she young and beautiful, but she's young and beautiful in the exact same way that his dead mother, the actress Elizabeth, had been. On the spot, Poe falls in love with Virginia. Things got so bad, a few months later, he goes up to his aunt and says, "Aunt Maria, you're going to think I'm crazy, but I am head over heels in love with your daughter Virginia. Will you let me marry Virginia, even though she's actually my first cousin?" Now, Aunt Maria did not say, "No, Edgar, you can hardly marry my daughter Virginia because she's your first cousin." What Aunt Maria did say was, "No, Edgar, you can hardly marry my daughter Virginia because she's 10.5 years old." Which she was. And Poe knew she was 10 years old. His taste in women, not good his entire life. He not only had fallen in love with a 10-year-old little girl, but it's his first cousin and adopted sister to boot. Aunt Maria said, "Edgar, if you would marry my daughter Virginia now, you would disgrace our family in public forever." She said, "I'm sorry, you're going to have to wait 3 years till she's 13, then it's great, and I'll give you a big wedding." Aunt Maria was crazy as well. It seems to have run through the whole family. Anyway, they wait 3 years, and when Poe is 26 and his first cousin Virginia is 13 years old, they get married. It is not a great marriage, but the worst thing about it, before they married, Poe was writing stories about dead people and nobody was buying them and he was starving. Now that they're married, he keeps writing stories about dead women. People still aren't buying them and he's still starving, but now they both are. We don't know what would have happened to them. Except now, the one man who did more to turn Edgar Allan Poe's life overnight completely around and make him famous as we know him today, it is now this man enters the story. You all know this man who would turn Poe's reputation around. You should know him. His name, Charles Dickens, the great English novelist who wrote Christmas Carol, Oliver Twist, all the other stories. What does Dickens have to do with Poe? Well, when Poe was starving in Richmond in 1842, Charles Dickens was the most famous young novelist on earth. So famous that we in America paid him a lot of money to come over to America on the first international superstar tour. We didn't want Dickens to do anything except shake hands with us, get his autograph. Women pulled at his clothes, fainted in the streets. Dickens really is the first young superstar on tour. He comes to America in 1842. One of the cities he's in, Richmond, Virginia, where Poe is struggling so hard. When Edgar Allan Poe hears that the great Charles Dickens is going to visit his town, he sends such a clever letter to Charles Dickens inviting him to lunch at a downtown Richmond hotel that Dickens not only accepts because he's charitable and wants to help out struggling writers, but Dickens shows up alone. So you have this incredible lunch between Edgar Allan Poe and Charles Dickens at this Richmond hotel. They sit down to lunch. Poe looks at Dickens and realizes that Charles Dickens has been crying. His eyes are red and wet. He's sniffling. So, of course, Poe says, "Mr. Dickens, why are you so sad?" And Dickens replied, "I was hoping you wouldn't notice, Mr. Poe, but since you asked me, I'll give you an honest answer." Dickens said, "I had a personal tragedy in my family right before I left England to come away to America, and I was thinking about it." Dickens said, "I have a wife and 3 little children, and we had a pet by the name of Grip, and we loved our pet Grip about as much as we loved each other." He said, "Right before I came away, I took my family on a weekend holiday. We did what we always did with Grip. We locked him up in our garage. We left plenty of food and water and figured he'd be fine for the 2 days. But," he said, "what we didn't realize this time, Mr. Poe, is when we put poor Grip in the garage, there was a big can of paint in the garage and the lid had fallen off. Unfortunately, the paint was a light blue-green color and it looked just like water. Poor Grip got confused, and rather than drinking up all of his water, he drank up all the paint by mistake, which was heavily laced with lead back then and was deadly poison." Dickens said, "Imagine our shock, Mr. Poe, when we unlocked the garage door on Sunday afternoon on our return. There was poor Grip, flat on his back, stiff as a board, legs sticking straight up, stone cold dead." Well, the minute that Edgar Allan Poe heard the phrase "stone cold dead," he perked up. This was his kind of conversation. This is all true. And he looked at Dickens and he went, "What a sad story." And then, just to be polite, he said, "What was poor little Grip? A little cat or a little dog?" And Dickens said, "Oh, no, Mr. Poe, we don't have normal pets in my family." He said, "Actually, Grip was a big, lovable, stupid, black raven." And Poe thought, raven. He had never thought about a raven before. We know this from his diary. He went home that night, opened up a drawer. There was a poem he had already written. Guess what it was about? It was about a very attractive, beautiful, clever, dead young woman named Lenore. He had titled it To Lenore. He had sent it out. Nobody had wanted it. Very typical with Poe. But this night, because he was inspired by this grotesque story Dickens had told him about his dead pet bird, he decided to change the poem just a bit. He kept as the centerpiece the dead young woman. That is Poe's major theme. He erased the title To Lenore and changed it to The Raven. He puts this black bird in every stanza. He has it say nevermore for reasons nobody's figured out in 150 years, and he sends it out again, and this time as The Raven, it is a smash hit. Everybody wants a copy of The Raven, and they'll pay any amount of money to get it. Even in Poe's day, it was a complete mystery to most people why this poem was this wildly popular piece. It was the most popular poem ever published, that goes all the way until today, ever published in America. They even asked Poe, why do you think it is so incredibly popular? Poe had two answers. The first one he said, maybe it is because I wanted to write in The Raven the first adult fairy tale. And people said, well, if you were going to write the first adult fairy tale, why didn't you open it with the 4 famous words of most fairy tales, once upon a time? And Poe said, but I did open it that way. And the people said, why don't you read your own poem? You opened it once upon a midnight dreary. And Poe's answer is significant. He said, but in my mind, all time is midnight dreary. And he's not kidding. You can read almost every poem and short story Poe ever wrote, and the one thing you won't find is a character walking down the street to the store on a sunny day. There is not one sunny day in the whole works of Edgar Allan Poe. Either his stories take place at night in a small room, sometimes getting smaller as the story begins, as in The Pit and the Pendulum, with flickering candlelight, or if he ever does on that rare occasion take you outside with the character, it is always the worst day of the year. The sky is black, a storm is coming, it's atrocious weather. His imagination was utterly dark. No sunny days in Poe's mind. The other reason he said The Raven might be so popular, he said he tried to capture in the unusual beat or cadence of each line the way a stately raven would actually walk. Well, that's a ridiculous reason. None of us care how a raven walks, but we certainly do remember the incredible, unusual, and haunting beat of The Raven. As you probably remember, it begins, once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as if someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I murmured, tapping at my chamber door, "only this and nothing more." Ah, distinctly I remember, it was in the bleak December, when each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I sought the morrow. That kind of rhythm and beat has never been duplicated in the history of the English language. Anyway, everybody wanted a copy of The Raven, and they would pay anything to get it. So how much money exactly did Poe make on The Raven? He made exactly 0, because he was really stupid. He decided to bring out The Raven first in a newspaper so he could hurry it into print, forgetting, of course, that if you publish your poem in a newspaper, that means there is no copyright protection. That meant every rotten poet could copy out The Raven and immediately bring out a book called My Greatest Poems, including The Raven Illustrated. It took Poe so long to bring out his edition, because he needed to get the backers with some money, that by the time he brought out his Raven, literally nobody was going to buy it because they'd bought someone else's, and so he made no money. And did he ever need that money? Because not long after The Raven was published, he went home one day to his young wife, and I mean young wife Virginia, and she said, "Look at my handkerchief, Edgar. I've coughed up blood. I have consumption, and I'm dying." Now Virginia is dying of consumption. But as she is dying, this is the most pathetic, because we learn that poor Poe had so little money when Virginia was dying that he could not afford to buy a blanket for Virginia's deathbed. And when you have consumption, one of the last things you have, terrible chills, they didn't even have a blanket. But they did have a pet, a long-haired cat named Katerina. Poe would actually have to pick up that cat, put it on Virginia's chest for her to hug as the only warmth in that tiny apartment. Poor Virginia dies. Poe is absolutely beside himself in grief, but there is a silver lining. If there is one thing Poe can do better than any other author has ever been able to do, it is to write a beautiful elegy, a tribute to a dead, beautiful young woman. He writes perhaps his most brilliant poem to his dead wife, Virginia. He takes it to a publisher who says, "Sorry, we can't publish this thing." "Why not?" says Poe. They said, "Look at the title. You've called it To Virginia. Our slower readers won't know, is this thing written to your home state or your dead wife? Change her name." Poe said, "What if I called her Annabel Lee?" He thought that was poetic. They liked that. He changes the name to Annabel Lee. He brings out the poem. It is another smash hit. His career finally seems to be on track. He is making money, and then the one thing he had always prayed for seemed to happen. A wealthy man in New York City writes Poe and says, "You are the greatest living author. I have the finest poetry magazine in America. I own it. If you will move from Richmond to New York City, not only will I let you edit my poetry magazine, a terribly prestigious position, but I'll pay you twice as much as any editor is currently getting." This is what Poe wanted. Not the money, though goodness knows he needed it, but the prestige of finally being someone respectable in the literary world. All he needed to do to start his new life was to move from Richmond to New York. He tried, never made it. Because back then, if you were going to move from Richmond to New York, you took the train. But you had to change trains in Baltimore, Maryland. He gets on the train in Richmond. It goes up to Baltimore. He gets off thinking he's going to walk down the track to get on the train to New York to his new and glorious life. Didn't happen. 'Cause Poe's bad luck, the day he ended up in Baltimore, they were holding election for mayor. And if a candidate wanted more votes back then, all he did was get someone to vote over and over for him under false names at different polling places until he got enough votes to win. But of course, nobody in Baltimore would ever do this for a candidate, because back then, if you were caught changing your name to vote illegally more than once, it was an automatic 10 years in the federal penitentiary. So what the candidates did, they sent their henchmen down to the train stations, hoping somebody weird-looking would get off a train that they could con into this plan. Guess how Poe looked the day he was in Baltimore? The way he always looked, weird. He gets off the train, a man comes up and says, "This is Baltimore, the friendly city. We'd like to buy you a drink." Poe says, "You can't buy me a drink. I'm an alcoholic." And goodness knows he was. Alcohol had helped ruin his life, and you have to admire Poe. He had gone off alcohol for good. He'd been on the wagon 6 months. He should have shut up, but just to be friendly, he said, "You know, when I used to drink, if I only had 1 shot of liquor, I would get so drunk I'd do anything, and then I wouldn't even know I'd done it." "Oh, really?" said the mayor's man. But he said, "We didn't want to get you alcohol. It's hot. We thought you might like a lemonade. Do you have time?" Poe checks his watch. He has time. They take him across the street to the Railroad Tavern, where they buy him something called Baltimore lemonade. In case you'd like the recipe, 5% lemons, 95% vodka. One of the strongest drinks you can imagine, but it doesn't taste like liquor. They give Poe 7 shots of this incredibly strong drink. They're all poison to Poe's system as an alcoholic. Finally, when he can't remember which fingers you put your pen between to write on a ballot, they figure they're finished with him. They push him towards the train station. They say, "Thanks a lot for helping us vote," and they send him on his way. An eyewitness tells us Poe took only 3 steps down that Baltimore street, and then he fell over. Now, you've all heard of people who die in the gutter. Usually, it's just a metaphor. It simply means you die poor. Not with Poe. Poe is actually the only person in literary history we know of who falls into a gutter, but he's not quite dead. That would be too easy. He's actually in a deep alcoholic coma. The horse ambulance comes by. They see this drunk in the gutter. They throw him in the wagon. They dump him at the front gate of the charity ward of the Baltimore hospital. Poe survives 3 days. On the 3rd day, he opened his eyes real wide, raised his head from his pillow, and screamed out in a voice so loud the entire ward heard him, "God have mercy on my soul!" And he fell back dead. He had just turned 40. He had never had a complete success in his life. The 4 women he loved the most all died in agony in front of him. Everything he seemed to touch turned into a complete and utter disaster. And yet today, more people in the world read the poems and short stories of Edgar Allan Poe than any other American who has ever lived. He is our #1 export in the world, surpassing even Mark Twain. My father, who grew up in Hungary, tells me in Hungary as a young boy, he had never heard of Shakespeare, never heard of Dickens, but by 6th grade, they were reading the stories of Edgar Allan Poe translated into Hungarian. In some countries today, Poe's reputation is unthinkable. France, for example. Ask anybody in France who is the greatest writer in the English language. The French never think that Shakespeare is. They actually believe that Edgar Allan Poe is the greatest writer who ever wrote in English, which sounds very impressive until you remember that the French think that Jerry Lewis is the greatest comedian who ever lived. So they obviously have taste problems, but nonetheless, they rank Poe at the very top of the English-speaking language in terms of writers. So the great irony with Poe, a man who could do nothing right during his entire life, in terms of his reputation, he has never been more appreciated than 150 years after his death. Thank you.